And my sincere apologies for this 15 minutes delay. I had really not foreseen that the highway would be so busy. I'm used to Montreal, just that I figured that at 6 o'clock, it will be finished. I don't often come around this area of the city. So again, my apologies. Today I'd like to talk about, I was asked to put in context the issue of Syrian refugees. So I understand that the main focus of the evening is to look at the recent history, the past century, to understand why we have refugees and where they come from and who they are. Is that okay? And by the way, how long can I go on? Until what time? Until I can talk for 3 hours, but but so I just want.
So we were looking at maybe now a little less than an hour and a half, and to have some time for questions.
Oh, so then
till 9.
Okay,
and
so
maybe we can have a 10-minute break.
That's great. That's fine. That's plenty. So I'll talk about 40 minutes so that we can have enough time for questions. Is that all right with you? Very good. Okay. So there are a few things I want to say before I go into the details. I just want to make sure that there are a couple of ideas that I get across. Like there are 5 points which I want to make sure that are clear, and then we'll look at these 5 points throughout the history, how they have unfolded. The first thing is that Syria, as we know it today, is a very artificial country. The boundaries are artificial. Historically, we'll see that in order to understand what's going on, you have to look at the whole Middle East. And I'll explain why. Okay? Basically, the people themselves, their solidarities, their families are spread out. The politics is spread out. And the history was, this was not the way people moved and migrated in the last 200 or 300 years was as if these were not boundaries. These were all provinces of the big Ottoman Empire. It's like Quebec and Ontario. Okay? So people traveled back and forth without having to ask for a passport. Okay? That's one thing to keep in mind. You cannot understand Syria unless you take into account Lebanon and Turkey and Iraq and Jordan and Palestine. Number 2. The whole Near East, I make a difference between the Middle East and the Near East. The Near East is basically, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. I'll show a map. I just want to present an overview of what I'm going to do. And so the whole Near East is a mosaic of people, of religions, of languages, and of ethnicities, and of modes of living. And I'll explain that a little too. There's a story of, you realize that there are very old Christian communities in the Middle East, right? And there's the story of this, American tourist going to Jerusalem and asking the driver of the car, are you a Muslim? He said, no, I'm a Christian. I said, who converted you? And he answered, Jesus, madam. Because these communities are very, very old. You know that in Syria, there are some communities who still speak in Aramean language. The very small communities, but they do speak in their everyday language. 2 villages, just 2 left, in the language in which the New Testament was written. Okay. So this mosaic I'll talk about. The third point, and this has tremendous consequences on one thing that also will be present throughout my presentation, which is for the last 200 years, there has been a crucial identity issue in the Near East. Are we mostly Arabs, Syrians, Lebanese, or are we Muslims, Christians, and so on? And this issue has not been resolved yet. So, in a country where you have a mosaic, there are 17 Christian communities in the Near East, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, 17 different, the Greek Orthodox and the Greek Catholics and the Maronites and the Chaldeans and the Assyrians and the Anglicans and the Armenian Catholics and the Armenian Orthodox and so on. 17. And there are at least 5 Muslim communities. The main Sunni community, which is the major one, but then you have the Shia, then you have the Alawite, which are a branch of the Shia, but an esoteric branch. Then you have the Druze, which are even a more esoteric branch. And then you have political trends within this. So there is no homogeneity. So when some group comes and say we'll do an Islamic State, then everybody beyond their group is automatically pushed out of the consciousness and of the national identity. That's one issue. The third issue is that Western politics, I'm talking about NATO countries, but also Britain essentially and the US, but France to some extent, have been extremely detrimental to the area. And I'll demonstrate that. And I'll show you why. Okay? We are claiming that we are spreading democracy. That's not true. And something connected to that is that the media are simply falsifying the truth. And I'll give you examples, very concrete examples of that. And the last point is that because of the history of colonialism and because of the political culture of the local people, so I'm not blaming everything on colonialism. I'm saying the interaction between these two things, the local political culture and the colonial agenda, have meant that the states have not been allowed to mature and become real, efficient, functional states. So they are mostly failed states or big tribes posing as a state. And of course, this is a caricature, right? But it's just to make my point clear that states don't function as states. Syria, how come it's a republic? You have a president, Bashar al-Assad, and his son succeeds. Not through an election like Trudeau, but through, and that one can talk about this as well, but through simply that, and that will be very clear, that they functioned like a tribe, not like a republic. Saddam Hussein was preparing his 2 sons to take over. Mubarak in Egypt was preparing Gamal, his son, to take over. And his other son, Ala, was taking over the financial sector and the industries, right? And so on. Now, so we have states that have not matured. So these are the 5 points which I would come back to that, and they will be sort of present throughout my presentation. So I will talk about these different points, and this is really a sort of an aide-memoire for myself. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about Syria. Sorry, I won't move too much. This is what we're talking about. It's a country that is, you see, compare it with Lebanon. Lebanon is just the small area here. Lebanon is this little part. Palestine is that little part. And I think here is a global view of the Middle East. So you see Syria is much bigger than Palestine and Lebanon. It's bigger than Jordan, which is just underneath Syria. And it's a little smaller than Iraq, which is on its right. It's a lot smaller than Turkey, which is above, and a lot smaller than Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is a desert. So you have very few people living in, the population of Saudi Arabia is less than the population of Syria, and a good part of Saudi Arabia is desert. So if I go back to Syria, there are 2 main sort of centers. Damascus, which is in the south, you see the word Damascus, very close to Lebanon, and Aleppo, which is in the north, very close to Turkey. And this proximity will explain why the rebellion have been in Aleppo. I'll talk a little about the rebellion, but I'll come back to the actual rebellion towards the end of my presentation. I want mainly to focus on the history now. So, at the beginning of the 20th century, Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was a province. There were no states at all in the Near East. There were provinces. Egypt was different because of the Near East. If I go back to the map we have, people have been traveling all over the place. You know, if I look at my own family, I have family in Damascus. Two of my grandparents are from Damascus. 2 are from Lebanon. I've been born in Egypt. My parents have been born in Egypt, and people travel, just like between provinces here. There was a train. You could take the train from Cairo all the way to Istanbul and go through Jerusalem and Lebanon and Iraq and everywhere. So it's part of the Ottoman Empire. There are no independent states. Egypt being different for a simple reason. Egypt is simply, I won't talk long about Egypt because it's not this topic, but just to distinguish it from the others. Egypt essentially is a valley in a desert. People live on 4% of the territory, which is the valley, where the Nile goes. And you can literally stand with a foot in the valley and a foot in the desert. It depends, the last irrigation ditch, where it gets there, that's the desert that begins. And so you have natural boundary, 2 big deserts that have a natural boundary. So the population of Egypt has not been mixing with the rest or at the same pace as the population of the other Near East countries. And there has been a state in Egypt for the last 4,000 years. Okay? There has been a state, the pharaonic states. And one little thing also, for the last 2,000 years, the leaders of Egypt were not Egyptians. The first Egyptian leader was Gamal Abdel Nasser after 2,000 years of foreign elites. There were the Greeks, then the Arabs, then the Mamluks, then the Turks. The king, Farouk of Egypt, was of Albanian descent. His dynasty had come as a representative of the Ottoman Empire. They spoke Turkish, not Egyptian. They did not know the language, neither Arabic nor Egyptian Arabic, nor a colloquial. And so, you know, that's a minor point, but it explains a lot of the things that we see. So, third point, the society was basically, people were thinking of themselves as 2 groups, Muslims and Christians. During the 17th and 18th century, there was a fashion of traveling to the Middle East, European fashion, of traveling to the Middle East to discover things. And one of the French travelers, Volney, had written a book on Syria and Egypt and said, Syria is strange. There are basically 2 kinds of people, Muslims and Christians, and they hate each other sincerely, and each of them considers the others to be apostates and bad people, and so said, how can you build a country like this? Now, I read this comment in a sociological study of 1980, and the author was saying, it's strange that 200 years later we're at the same point. Now, the last thing to understand about Syrian society is what is called the millah system. Millah means community. And in Turkish they use the word millet. And millah means basically confessional community, not religious, confessional. Because even within the same religion, like Christianity, there was the millah of the Maronites, and the millah of the Greek Orthodox. And the word Greek, by the way, here does not refer to present-day Greece. It refers to the 5th century dispute between the Byzantine Church and Rome. And that community was an Orthodox Eastern community, so it was related to Byzantia, or whatever, how do you say that in English, Byzantia, and therefore it called itself the Greek. And it was Orthodox. It was the whole Christianity in the Middle East used to be Orthodox. And it's only in the last, except the Maronites. The Maronites have been loyal to Rome since several, I don't know by heart the moment where they started thinking of themselves as Maronites, but probably more than 1,000 years. So they were close to Rome. All the other communities were Orthodox and much closer to the Russian Orthodox Church or the Greek Orthodox Church. And it's only in the last 2 centuries that missionaries who went in the Middle East hoping to convert Muslims to Christianity, well, they did not convert Muslims to Christianity, but they converted Orthodox Christians to Catholicism. So this is what happened. So you have, for every church, you have a twin, you have twin sisters, the Greek Catholics and the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Catholics and the Armenian Orthodox, the Assyrian Catholics and the Assyrian Orthodox, and so on. And so the Ottomans ruled this situation by recognizing the autonomy of every confessional group. I was saying all this to say that people think of themselves as confessional group, not religious group, because, a Maronite, it would be a problem if a Maronite wanted to marry somebody from the Greek Orthodox community because they were Catholic and Orthodox. And even from some other Catholic community, people would tend to stick to their community. And it was the head of the church who was responsible for keeping the order and making sure that his parishioners, his people, would be loyal to the empire, which is the Ottoman Empire, based in Turkey, right? And that system lasted for 400 years. Since the Ottoman governed the Near East until the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1916 and 18, somewhere between 16 and 18, like during the First World War. So, you see, we won't stay long here. Just an example. The political system was every big city was a province with its hinterland. And the hinterland provided, the agriculture, the meat, and so on to the big city. And so you have all those. And then they were just regrouped into around Damascus and Aleppo. And if you look at the map at this time, look at the map. Syria meant present-day Syria, present-day Lebanon, the southern part of Turkey, the northern part of Iraq, and all of Palestine. All of that was Syria. It was divided in provinces, like Quebec would be divided into Gaspé versus Montérégie and so on. People did not think of themselves as belonging to different countries. They thought of themselves as belonging to different communities, but the communities were spread all over the place. So a Melkite from Cairo would feel much closer to a Melkite from Baghdad and Damascus and Jerusalem than otherwise. You see, that's how. And this is a reminiscent of the tribal system, because what is a tribe? Let me just open a parenthesis here. See, the whole Middle East, the political culture, people think in terms of kin relationships and kin solidarity. Why? This is a desert or a semi-arid area with some valleys. Basically, there are 2 big valleys. The Mesopotamia, between the Euphrates and the Tigris River, and then Egypt. And the others are small agricultural communities, but not really peasants. You don't have big, big rivers that sustain a peasant community. You don't have so the peasant mentality is very different from the tribal mentality. Tribal mentality, you move from place to place in search of water. You go to an oasis with your flock, with your camels and your sheep. And if the water dries, then you go to some other oasis and you keep moving between the small wells and small water points so to allow them to replenish from the groundwater. And so people don't have a solidarity to a place. You don't have neighbors. You don't feel loyalty to your neighbors. You don't have stable neighbors, right? Your loyalty is to your kin and to the clan and to the tribe. That's why kin relationships are so important in the Middle East. And that's why you have all these rules about the way women should behave, because the women are the one who guarantee the lineage and the continuity of the clan. So women cannot fool around and just, so they have a dress code, they're part of the community, they belong to their family and so on, because it's not because they're backward, it's just because the way the economy is organized is such that it makes sense to be loyal to your kin. So you have to make sure who is your kin, right? And so that's why the loyalty is to the kin and to the group and to the community. And in the urban areas in the Middle East, the thing is completely different. People have a cosmopolitan sense of identity in the urban areas. And so you have basically three cultures informing Arab societies: the tribal culture, the urban culture, and the rural culture of peasants who are very much in solidarity and they are loyal to the place. Urban culture, people travel a lot too, but they're more cosmopolitan, they're more open. So we have these three cultures. So this is Syria. Now, why I'm mentioning this? Because most of the troubles we are going through today come from the fact that the colonial powers decided to carve this up according to their needs and not according to the political logic of the place. So there are three big patterns that were at work. All of that happened in World War I or around World War I. Why? There was this Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire had been there for 400 years, and it was being weakened little by little over the 19th century. Why? Because the wealth of the Ottoman Empire was based on local agriculture on one hand and on long-distance trade on the other hand. Long-distance trade between Africa and Asia, between the Far East and the Near East and Europe. And once the routes through the sea had been discovered to India and to China, all the trade route along what is called the Silk Road. Is this something familiar? The Silk Road. The Silk Road has been going from China to the Near East and to Europe through the land. And the civilization along the Silk Road, having there for 2,000 years, not for the 400 years of the European Renaissance, you see? China, India, Vietnam, Cambodia, Central Asia. Think of all these areas of where civilization grew, and these different civilizations have been there for for several thousand years. So, when the sea routes were discovered, the wealth of the Ottoman Empire started declining little by little. And then the colonial powers started competing over who will inherit the different parts of this empire. And throughout the 19th century, there is a political concept called the Great Game. There are several books written with this title. Just Google the Great Game. You will see that's the competition between the British Empire and the Russian Empire to make sure they'll take over when the Turkish Empire is gone. Now, with World War I, there are three things that started to happen. The British started to work with the Arabs in the south, present-day Saudi Arabia, to undermine the Turkish presence. And so I'll go into some of the details of the deals they made with Sharif Hussein. So Hussein was a tribal leader who became nominated between the tribes as the Sharif of Mecca. The Sharif means the head, the spiritual and political head of Mecca. And that was in the early 20th century. And so the British made a deal with him. They said, if you help us fight the Ottoman Empire and expel the Ottomans from the Arab Peninsula where there is oil, there wasn't much oil, but the peninsula had a little oil, but it was a strategic turning point. It was the road to India. See, the road to India went through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, which had been dug inaugurated in 1869. Okay, so it went through Red Sea and it went through Yemen. Yemen was controlling the narrow strait to get out of the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. So controlling Yemen was something very important. And Yemen is part of Yemen is part of the Arabian Peninsula. So Yemen was that one thing. Then, see, so they promised in exchange, we'll give you an Arab state. We'll help you establish an Arab state which would cover southern Arabia, up to Syria, up to Palestine, up to Lebanon. That will be the Arab state that will give you if you help us get the Turks out. And he embarked on that. At the same time, they made a deal with the Saudis that, maybe, Saudi can be a better ally. So they armed the Saudis, they helped the Saudi take over Mecca, destroy all the mausoleums of the family of the Prophet, and establish this rigid Wahhabi rule with the help of the British because it suited them. Now, that's one thing happening in southern Arabia. At the same time, they worked out a deal with the French. They said, okay, you take the northern part of the Near East, it's the area A that you see here, and the southern part will be under British mandate. The French part will be, the top part will be under French mandate. This straight line is called the Sykes-Picot line, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes was the British officer who negotiated it, and Mr. Georges Picot was a French one. They negotiated that, and they got their parliaments to approve of this division. And so, if you notice, compare this map. Look at this part of the map. Look at this part. It cuts the southern part of Syria. It removes Palestine from it. All right? it keeps, in principle, the northern part of Palestine, even the northern part, look carefully. You see, here, it keeps Palestine completely out. It gives Lebanon and Syria to the French, and Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine to the British. So that was the second deal. The third deal was with the Zionist movement. Again, you cannot, I'll explain that. You cannot understand Syria today unless you understand what happened to Palestine. In 1900, Palestine was 94% Arabs to be precise, and 6% Jews, who were there essentially for religious reasons. You know, all the communities in Quebec, the Christian communities, have their house in Jerusalem, and the novices would go there, do training for 6 months in Jerusalem, which is the holy place, and come back. So, and the Jews were the same. They had their communities there for religious reasons, and some of them settled, and they started settling seriously, not for religious reason, in 1860. But their numbers were absolutely minimal. Until 1900, there were only 6% of Jews in Palestine. And in 1970, because the Jews were emancipating in Europe, on one hand, and were facing serious discrimination that culminated in pogroms in Russia and with the Holocaust in Germany. The Russian Tsar found it a good way to deflect anger of the peasants in Russia by saying, it's the Jews who are responsible for our problems and for the inequalities and so on. And there were a couple of pogroms, a couple of several places where Jews were massacred in their villages in Russia. And the anti-Semitism was growing in the whole of Europe. You've all heard of the Dreyfus affair, where a French colonel or general, the French officer, who was Jewish also, who was absolutely loyal to the French Republic, was accused by his superiors of having transmitted to Germany some military secrets because they had done it themselves. And in order to protect themselves, they said, it's a Jew who did it. And the French opinion believed them. And they tried him and exiled him out of France. And there was a big debate. And at this time, an Austrian journalist by the name of Theodor Herzl was covering the trial and said, Europe will never accept us. We need a country of our own, us Jews. Europe will not allow us to become full citizens in Europe. And he started a movement called the Zionist movement, who said, well, we are Jews of Europe, we are not welcome, we are a people without a land, but there's a land over there in Palestine without people. And he wrote the slogan in his book. In the book, Jewish State, he wrote the slogan, a land without people for a people without land. Now the trouble is that the land was not without people. It was full of people, the Palestinians. So, because of the political help Britain got from the Zionist movement, and because the head of the Zionist movement, Chaim Weizmann, was a chemist who helped invent the cannon powder. Oh no, it was already there, but to develop it and make it more efficient and so on. He helped develop, arms. And Britain felt that they owe him something. But also, they wanted to have Europeans in the heart of the Arab world to be able to serve for them as a military base. So they promised the Jews that they will help them make a country of their own in Palestine. This is the Balfour Declaration. It says, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet." And the declaration says, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." Now, look at this. Concerning the inhabitants of Palestine, they talk about their religious and civil rights. The word political rights of the people there does not appear. But the political rights of Jews in Europe is there. So you will not lose any political rights in Europe. You will gain a political entity in the Arab world, and the local inhabitants will not be protected. Their political rights will not be protected by us. That declaration was incorporated in the British Mandate for Palestine in 1922, and the House of Lords in Britain discussed this. And the House of Lords, after a very long debate, came to the conclusion that the British Mandate of Palestine would violate the promises made by the British to the Arabs. And they rejected the British Mandate. The British House of Lords said Britain should not accept the British Mandate because it violates the rights of the Palestinians. They didn't call them Palestinians, they called them the Arabs, because there was no such country, the Arabs of Palestine. Palestine was called Palestine, but it was an area, not a country, right? So what do you get? You get the northern part of Syria cut off the southern part. All of that was Syria. The French then cut up even more, divided the northern part of Syria into Lebanon and Syria. And whereas that was all part, you see, in the list of provinces I showed you, the province of Damascus covered part of Lebanon, the central and southern part, and the province of Aleppo covered the northern part of Lebanon. It was part of it. The border did not exist. Not only the border did not exist, people traveled back and forth. They thought of themselves as one community, the big Syrian community. Right? So, there was a series of broken promises that I've summarized here. The promise of an Arab state to the Sharif of Mecca in exchange for his participation in the revolt. But a deal with the Saud clan, who seized the Hijaz in 1925. Another deal with the Zionists, which I did not list here because I'm focusing on Syria, I just explained it now. Now, when it was clear that the British would not fulfill their promises, what did they do? They wanted to compensate the Sharif of Mecca for his loyal services. He had helped defeat the Turks. So they created Transjordan and put one of his sons as the king. And they created it out of nowhere. And they took the other son and offered to him, well, they did not offer. The Arabs, the Sharif of Mecca and his family, with the Syrians, agreed that the other son, Faisal, would be king of Syria. But when they agreed to split the Syria in the northern part and the southern part of Syria, and they called the northern part given to the French and southern part to the British, the French expelled the king. So the British told him, okay, we'll give you a consolation prize. You'll be the king of Iraq. And so basically, they took the two sons of the Sharif of Mecca, which is far down in the south. You know, I'll just bring back the map, the overall map. You see, we're here, right? Okay, this is where Mecca is, okay? This is where Mecca is. The Hijaz is an area. This is Mecca and the Hijaz. So they took the two sons of this guy and put one king of Iraq, first of Syria, then he was expelled of Iraq. They created Transjordan, put the other king there, and then here they brought the Saud who were there and told them, okay, you take control of the south because you are better allies than the others. And the others will give them this consolation prize. And then this part, Palestine, will give them to Europeans, which are the Jewish Europeans. Right? And so at the end of the war, a British officer who saw all this, he said, this is a peace, because there was a peace at the end of the war. He said, this is a peace that will end all peace. And there is a book written by, his name was come back to me. If you Google it, the title of the book is A Peace to End All Peace. And this book looks at the political earthquakes that rocked the Near East during World War I and after World War I, and all the rearrangement and the creation of all these borders that were not there, and some of the problems we're living today are a direct result of that. Okay? Now, let me now jump, because time is running by. I'll take a few minutes. Can we take it another 10 minutes, and then we have 45 minutes to discuss? And I'll try to make it shorter.
Break maybe in 10 minutes?
Yeah. I'll make it shorter than 10 minutes, okay? I want to come to today. When the independences came, after World War I, the idea of having mandates to rule over people in the Middle East and Africa and Asia and so on was no longer acceptable after World War I. A new set of principles of international law were put forward, and the independence of nations were recognized. But at the same time, the countries did not want to give the British and French did not want to give full independence to these countries. They wanted to give them formal independence, but not real independence. So they continued to just pull the strings from behind and then pressure them and so on. So, but the point is that there were independences. Some of these independences, they gave independence and put a king who was loyal to the British or to the French in Syria, right? And then the people there, some of them revolted. And so you had a number of coups d'etat or revolts in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, not in Palestine. It was the Zionists, the European Jews, who managed to take control of the country as a result of a long. If you want to hear about this, we'll have another discussion. Please ask me; I'll be happy to come and explain that. But that's another story. Now, in Egypt, it's the only country where the coup was bloodless. Not a single shot was fired. The king was removed and treated decently. He was put on his yacht with his family and a lot of money and sent to Europe. And a military junta took over, and it was a coup d'etat. But people recognized that this was them. They approved of it. In Iraq and Syria, because of this meddling, you see, in Egypt there was not so much meddling in local politics. In Iraq and Syria, the British had taken a king from Mecca, put it there, and then placed him in Iraq, and then put another king in Jordan, and then expelled the Palestinians. There was a lot of turmoil. So there was no agreement on what system to put. So the coup d'etat were all bloody and numerous. Every couple of months they would have a coup d'etat, and the new rulers would come and cut off the head of the previous one, or kill them, or treat them in a very sort of violent way. So we had a series of coup d'etat in Iraq and a series of coup d'etat in Syria, and throughout this coup d'etat, the Americans, who were gradually replacing the British as the big rulers, were meddling more and more, because Russia had, the Soviet Union had risen, and the Americans did not want the Soviet Union to have a foot in the Arab land, so they were trying to themselves push forces here and there to remove some of the leaders who were not favorable to them, and so on. In 71, after a long series of very bloody coup d'etat, Hafez al-Assad became the president of Syria. And he ruled for about 30 years. Now, I'll take a few minutes to explain that, because that has a direct impact on the war in Syria and the refugee issue. I said that there were basically two groups, Muslims and Christians. But that's not exact, because within the Muslim community there were the Alawite, which are a branch of Shiism, who were treated very poorly by the majority Sunnis and discriminated against and considered to be not real good Muslims, and relegated to their mountains and villages, were not allowed. If they would, it would be dangerous for the Alawite to go down from his village and to go into the big city. Okay? Now, with the independence, ideas of equality and citizenship were surfacing. So one of the Syrian leaders in the early 60s, I'm not too sure the exact year, had proposed to remove the requirement that the president be a Muslim. And there were riots. People said, how come you want to destroy the Islamic dimension, the Islamic identity of Syria? And so he had to backtrack and reinstate the requirement that the president must be a Muslim, and this is a Muslim country. So Hafez al-Assad came from this Alawite minority, and because of these new ideas of equality of all citizens, they opened up the school system and the army to everybody, and gave free education for those who wanted to enroll in the army. So who were the first one to enroll? The Alawites, because they were left out by the system. They had a free education, and they could become officers, and then they could climb in the social hierarchy. So Hafez al-Assad was part of this Alawite community. When he took over and took power, he found that the best, more secure allies were his fellow Alawites. Why? Because no political force was hegemonic and dominant. And so if you didn't protect yourself, you would have been overthrown in a bloody coup d'etat and killed like the others. There have been at least a dozen coup d'etat in Syria in the 15 preceding years. So the only way to survive and to build the country, to build the industry and the economy and the education, was to take control of the country. So he established a very severe system of political control and repression based on the Alawite. And so it became, although the principles at the beginning were secular, it became a sectarian system. And when you count on the secret police to keep order, you cannot work by the law. It cannot be a state of law, because you see somebody that you don't trust, you just put him in prison. So you give him a lot of leeway to the secret police so that they can protect you. But when you do that for 30 years, the secret police becomes an independent mafia. And it has its own agenda. And it works like a mafia. And it seizes whatever it can. And so it becomes a corrupt system. Now, this corrupt system was compensated by the nationalist agenda of the Assad regime, father and son. There was a nationalist agenda. They resisted Israel, they wanted to develop the country, they were developing agriculture, digging canals, irrigation canals, sponsoring agriculture, sponsoring education, sponsoring health, sponsoring universities and artists and writers and book printing, everything. So people said, we are developing. So then the system was threatened by everybody around it, by Israel, by the Americans, by the Russians. Everybody was threatening the system. So people said, well, it's normal that we have a police state because otherwise we will be infiltrated, our country will be destroyed. So they accepted the police state, and in exchange for that there was development. Now in 2006, as a result of the pressures by the Americans, the system started to open to the open economy, to capitalist economy. It was already there because of corruption, but it became more open, and the subsidies and the support to the poor were stopped. And so from 2006, and especially from 2008, the poor rural people started becoming poorer. And then they became more ready to revolt. Repression was acceptable when everybody benefited economically and socially. It stopped being acceptable when it was the system was not delivering what it should. And when the Arab revolts started in 2011, people said, well, maybe we should do the same in Syria and change the regime. And people started revolting peacefully, but, and I'll stop with this, but neither Saudis, nor the Turks, nor the Americans wanted to see a democratic Syria for their own reasons. So they all started financing the jihadi Islamist groups to bring down the Syrian government. And they took over the peaceful revolts, who stopped being peaceful. Since the very beginning, they started shooting and killing soldiers and militarized the revolt, and then that was game over for the democracy. It was game over for democracy because the system, rather than being a democratic protest against a repressive government, it became a plot executed by the jihadi Islamist violent fundamentalist groups for the benefit of the Turks, the Saudis and the Americans, and it became a war. And so people started fleeing. Now, I think I'll stop here, and we'll continue after the break with questions that will get us to speak about the refugees, how the Turks played with this refugee issue. And we'll come to that, and I'll listen to your questions and maybe explain what I have to say as an answer to your questions. Thank you for listening. Too long in the first half, but I thought that these were elements that were useful to understand. So I would like in the half hour that's left, and I don't mind going a little beyond if you want, but we can stop. It's up to you. Okay? I would like to just proceed rather by questions, so that my answer will be more focused on your interrogations. Okay, so yes.
Yes, I'm unclear still on the role of Russia. Why is Russia so involved in backing Hezbollah?
Yes, I'll tell you. For many reasons. So did everybody hear the question? The question is, why is Russia so involved? Because what is going on in Syria now is not a fight for democracy. You know, the reasons why NATO countries want to bring Assad down, it's because it's the only country in the Near East now that is not under American influence. And so, because it is, see, by bringing Assad down, what you do is first they hope to put a regime that is loyal to Saudi Arabia, on one hand, more an Islamist regime, closer to Saudi Arabia and therefore closest to the Americans. What this will do is that it will prevent Iran helping Hezbollah fight against Israel. So Israel will be able to bomb and occupy southern Lebanon again, as it did in the past twice. And the only thing that prevented them from staying is the resistance of Hezbollah with Iranian arms. And these arms transit through Syria. The other point is that by bringing down Syria, they'll be able to threaten Iran, and it will be one step in encircling Russia. These conflicts are not thought of in terms of months or years. They are thought of in terms of decades or centuries. There is an article in a magazine called Mother Jones, and the title is The 30-Year Itch. And if you Google the 30-year itch, you'll see an interactive map showing how in the 70s, the Americans had no military bases in the Near East. And over a 30-year period, they put the bases one after the other. In Saudi Arabia, then in Iraq, then Iran, then in Jordan, then to encircle Iran and Syria, and eventually Russia. So the battle is about who will, which imperial forces will control the Middle East. Since 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, there has been one superpower at the level of the world, which is the Americans. It is now challenged not by the Russians, but by a coalition of Russia, China, Brazil, India, and South Africa, the BRIC countries. Now, the Chinese have it's an opinion, okay? It's an opinion based on what I've read. So I'm not studying China. So, you know, part of what I say is just an opinion, okay? But I will share it. The Chinese think of the New World Order not in terms of one or two superpowers, but in terms of concertation, discussion, sharing. And they want to work with the Russians and with India and with South Africa and with Brazil to bring something else and to resist the globalization that is led by banks. Basically, it's the bankers who are leading the globalization now, the financial sector. And they have a different agenda. And so the reason why Syria is important is that Syria would have been a very important step to reinforce American control of the area, and Russia sees that as a threat, and that's why Russia and Iran and China are all supporting Assad. But they all say, we want a change. And this ties in with the question of the media. Since the beginning of the uprisings, the government in Syria has changed the constitution to allow multi-party system. It has relaxed many of the repressive laws. It has done a lot of things in order to change. But that's not what the Americans want. They don't want the same regime with more democracy. They want a different regime. And Russia says, well, it's our interest that's there. And not just the Russian interest. Today, I claim that most Syrians would prefer the regime to stay. And you don't see these pictures. There's a journalist by the name of, I forgot her first name, I think it's Victoria Bleeny, Bleeny. If you Google her name, she has pictures of the population, civilian population in Aleppo welcoming the government forces and being so happy of being delivered from the jihadis who are ruling them. And there is a lot of support. And then we have been really misinformed about this. Every time there was an attack, it said, well, the regime forces have thrown chemicals on the civilian population. And then there's an MIT study, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, study that says that 52 of the chemical attacks were done by the rebels, not by the government. Right? And so, you have a lot of very nasty things being done by the rebels that the media do not report. They all blame it on the government. If you want just to have an idea, just compare Aleppo and Mosul, right? In Mosul, in Iraq. In Mosul, every time the Americans and Iraqi bomb the jihadis, they say, well, the forces of democracy are progressing, we are bombing the Islamists. And in Aleppo, they don't say the regime is bombing the Islamists, they say it's bombing the civilian population. There are almost no civilians in the areas that are left in Aleppo, it's just the rebels and their families. And so, so this is a short answer. Well, it's a long answer, but it's too short given what's going on.
Syria's always been good to the Christians, hasn't it, down through the years?
Yes and no. I'll tell you, because of these circumstances, the regime has become sectarian, right? But at the same time, it was maintaining a secular system where citizens would be treated as citizens, not as Christians, Muslims, and so on. So a lot of Christians feel, not just Christians and Muslim minority groups, the Druze, the Alawites, feel that the system is better, as it is better for them than an Islamic state or an Islamic government like that of Turkey, or worse, like that of Saudi Arabia. Yes?
I know that the Christians in Syria have been attacked and persecuted. What is this has happened to them now, or where are they now?
Look, first, the Christians in Syria are spread out all over Syria, not in specific places. They tended to flee to government-controlled places or to flee and become refugees. In the areas where the rebels were in control, they have been seriously discriminated, sometimes killed, and they've had a very hard time. Very hard time. There are images, if you just look at if you just Google Ma'lula, this village, that's a village where they still speak Aramean. When the jihadis entered the village, they went in every church and they just desecrated it and burned everything, brought things down, and so Christians feel that the rebels, first the word rebels, basically the democratic movement now has disappeared because the democratic movement did not want to do a war. It wanted to do it demanded a reform. When the war became militarized, they withdrew and they still wish for a regime, for a change of regime, but peacefully. But the ones who are in control in the land are all jihadi groups, all of them. Now the Americans have renamed some of them. Jabhat al-Nusra is the same old guys with a new name. No, really, and look, I'm not. It's not a caricature. I mean, it's literally true. And that's why when the Americans said, "Oh, we will send arms to the good rebels," are, and then all the arms ended up in Al-Qaeda because they work together, and they are the same people. So that's why it's right now what is called the rebellion is basically jihadi groups who have the same view of the world as Saudi Arabia, and they come into different shades and colors. That you have Daesh, you have the Al-Qaeda, and then you have about 100 of small groups, all of the same type of ideology, with minor variations and with a local group here and a local leader here and there, but working essentially through the same logic. And so the Alawi Muslims and the Druze and the various Christian communities and a majority of Sunni. That's very important to say. See, the minorities, the religious minorities, all together do not add up to more than 30% of the Syrian population. 70% are Sunni Muslims. And those who support the regime today, the majority of Sunni Muslims are on the side of the regime. Not because they like the regime, they won't change. They find it's a dictatorship, they were put in prison arbitrarily, they hate the regime. But the alternative today is worse. And so they say, let's have the regime and then we'll make the changes. Now, not everybody agrees with that. I know personally a number of friends who are from the democratic tendency, who may be Muslims or Christians or neither, who think that as long as the regime is there, nothing will happen. And no change, no positive change will happen. So they say the regime should go down. And some of them are so angered by the repression they went through. Some of them were put in prison and they were tortured. So it's understandable that they take this stand. But if you look at it from the geopolitical point of view, they see it only from a local point of view. But the driving forces are not local. The driving forces are geopolitical forces. These jihadi have been getting money and logistic support and intelligence support, essentially either directly from the Americans or from the Americans through the Saudis and the Turks. Why is Aleppo at the north? Why is Aleppo the center of resistance? Because all the arms and money have come from Turkey. Turkey. And that's the border with Turkey. There has been some resistance here coming from Iraq. And then also, the regime has been playing very dirty games too. I mean, when the Americans went to Iraq in 2003, and see what happened in Iraq. I was saying to Mr. Shea, you cannot understand Syria separately from the whole region, from Iraq in particular. When the Americans went, see, in Syria, the majority are Sunni, and the government was Alawi. And Alawi are close to the Shia, one branch of the Shia. In Iraq, under Saddam, the majority were Shia, and the regime, which is a minority, was Sunni. So when the Americans came in 2003, they did something very bad. They dismissed completely all of the army of Saddam Hussein, all of them, not just the top people, everybody. And all of the people who had a card of the ruling party, the Ba'ath party. But people were forced to have cards. If you did not have a card, you could not work. So they put a few million people on the street without any salary. And so the Shia government who took over, the government of Maliki and the other prime ministers took over, behaved in a very sectarian way, and they did not behave as Iraqi nationals, they behaved as Shia wanted to take revenge of the Sunnis. So what happened is that the Sunni resistance took two forms. It took the form of the jihadi groups, the Islamists, and it took the form of the officers and soldiers of the army of Saddam Hussein. The army were mostly Sunni. They were put in prison or just pushed in the streets without any salary. And so they linked up with the Islamists. And Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State, part of it, the official ideology is jihadi Islamists, but the real people who think in terms of strategy and think of the war are all the secular officers of Saddam Hussein who joined the fight. Now, what the regime in Syria did is that it helped the jihadi to annoy the Americans when they were there, and he helped them. And so when they decided that it was time to get rid of him, they came back. And the same game was played by everybody. Everybody thought they could use and manipulate and instrumentalize the Islamist groups. The Americans did it in Afghanistan. And, you know, we're not in conspiracy theory anymore. I mean, all of that is thoroughly documented. There is a book by the name of an anthropologist at Columbia University in New York. He's a Tanzanian by the name of Mahmoud Mamdani. He holds a very prestigious chair of anthropology at the university, at Columbia University in New York. He wrote a book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And he documented how the United States decided that those who work with them are the good Muslims and those who work against them are the bad Muslims. And therefore, they supported all the jihadi groups in Afghanistan because they were working with them, therefore they were good Muslims. And all of that is documented with official documents. You have the Library of Congress number, you can check the documents themselves. The CIA funded these groups. I still have pictures of Ronald Reagan on the front door of the White House with Taliban leaders saying, these are the freedom fighters. And, as I said, it's not a conspiracy theory. I have the pictures. If we had time, I would show them to you. I have them in another presentation, PowerPoint presentation. So Hafiz al-Assad did, and Bashar al-Assad did the same thing. They tried to use the jihadis against their enemies, and at one point the jihadis came against them. And so it's a mess. In other words, look, the end of the crux of the story is that there are no good guys and bad guys. Okay? Everybody's a bad guy. And we're in a mess. And the mess is the result of 100 years of colonial history. Okay? And it's very hard to see how to get out of it. But there have been situations like that in Europe too. There was World War I, there was World War II, and finally when people settled their basic deep differences, peace came and old enemies made peace. So there is hope that at one point there will be peace. But before there will be peace, there will be a lot more conflict, unfortunately. Yes?
My question is, why is it most likely to happen now? That we have all...
Just a minute, I have my crystal ball somewhere.
Based on your...
Yeah, I understand. No, I'm just joking. No, look, the balance of power is so unstable that it's very difficult to predict things, okay? But there is a direction. Right now, the Syrian regime is gradually taking over. All over Aleppo is almost under control now. So the Americans, though, do not want to accept that they've lost there. And so they're still funding and encouraging the Turks to fund and to, continue the war. And because, look, these guys, the jihadis, the Islamic State and the Qaeda, have no access to the sea. All the equipment they have must come from the land. So it must come from Turkey and a little from Jordan. So as long as, and these countries can block everything. Now Turkey is in trouble because of the coup d'etat, and they've understood that they have to deal with Russia and make compromises. So they will, and then the Islamic State is also attacking the Turkish government and Turkey. And then the Kurdish issue comes in. And so the Turks will be, I think, less efficient in meddling with the affairs in Syria. So there is a possibility that within a year, because these things take time, that within a year there may be a little more stability. Unless the different forces who do not want peace to happen will continue. There is an American strategist who wrote a theoretical piece, and he invented the concept of constructive instability. He called it this way. I'm not paraphrasing what he says. He said this: constructive instability, and he said we have to cause instability. In my words, I call that chaos. We have to cause chaos. His words is instability, in order to allow a realignment in forces that are in our favor. That's what he called constructive. So they may continue for months, but if you look at alternative news, not mainstream media, you will see that the places where the government forces enter, people welcome them. And so it doesn't mean that the regime of Bashar al-Assad is good. It's a bloody, repressive regime, but it's a nationalist regime. And there is a chance that things evolve and move once the external threats diminish. What forces the regime to be that repressive is the constant external threats. So the regime has to be repressive in order to protect itself and to protect society as well. And so, that's why I'm saying there are no good guys. It seems that we're going through in a direction that might bring a way out of the impasse, but we are in an impasse, and no political forces is clearly stronger than the other. When you have one political force that's stronger, then it can impose its will on the others. As long as no one is really stronger than the others, then the weaker forces, there's always be somebody outside of the country to say, we like this guy, it serves our interest, so we'll... No. Every time if a political force is weakened and it's about to disappear, there's somebody who comes and say, we'll help you with money, with arms, and then, they pay their people and then they start again. But now there's something else happening. Because these jihadi forces are seeing that they are losing, so all the jihadis are going back to their country of origin. That's why France is so worried, because France helped them go. And then they are coming back now to France, so it's a problem. So we're not yet, in French I say, on n'est pas sorti du bois, we're not out of the bush. It's. I think we'll go through more turmoil before it gets better, unfortunately.
Do you think the Americans will accept Assad if things start?
Oh, they've already accepted it, him, and there are lots of American politicians who said, first they said, we won't even discuss with Assad. There is no future for Assad. But 2 years ago, they started changing and say, well, we'll have to come to terms with Assad. Now, with Trump coming to power, Trump is awful and racist and everything, but at the same time, he doesn't want headaches in Syria. So he may stop this policy. Now, he will be very bad for other things, okay? I'm not, don't misunderstand me. I'm
getting refugees from America.
I have no sympathy for his racist rhetoric, right, and Islamophobia. But in terms of foreign policy, he might not be as bad as Hillary Clinton, who funded and supported all the jihadi groups because they wanted to get rid of the. Notice one thing: all the groups, all the jihadi activities. What country did it happen in? Just in the countries that are hostile to the, not hostile, but they're not in the pocket of the Americans. These groups are transnational. The political ideology is everywhere in all the countries. How come they are active only in the countries that the US want to destabilize? And that's the game that Clinton played, and Obama, unfortunately, with beneath his smile. Just before you answer, I just want to jump to Libya, okay? Because you'll understand why I'm saying that. Why did they bring Gaddafi down? For years, his policy has not changed. Okay, he has even funded the electoral campaign of Nicolas Sarkozy in France. They receive him with honors in Italy, in France, and in the United States, and allow him to put his tents on the gardens to live there because he wanted to look like a Bedouin who is defending Bedouin values. But then he started doing three things. He started funding a satellite network for Africa so that they would not depend on European satellite networks. He started building a development bank for Africa because he had a lot of money from oil, so that they would not depend on the high interest rates of the foreign banks. And he did make an airline company that linked all the African capitals, so that if you wanted to go from Chad to whatever, you do not have to transit through Paris and then come back. Okay? And so these three domains where Europe was sucking the wealth out of Africa. And that was too much. So we had to get rid of them. And so we invented things like, invented or wanted to invent against it. Remember, look, there is a precedent. You remember the issue of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq?
Yes.
When Colin Powell came with Lego toy trucks showing on artificial sand, said, these are the trucks and these are the things that they are doing, and this is a model of. And then it turns out there is no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It was invented. Most of you may remember the issue of incubators in Kuwait. Does that ring a bell? In 1991, when the public opinion was not in favor of bombing Iraq, 1991, they brought a Kuwaiti nurse in tears who said, I was working in the hospital and the Iraqi soldiers came and took the babies in the incubators, threw the babies on the floor and got them to die, and took the incubators for Iraqi hospitals. And that changed the mentality. That was on all chains of TV. And then it turned out that this nurse is nobody else than the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, and that a public relations company was hired to create this thing, and it was spread over all the networks, and it changed public opinion, and it turned out to be a hoax. And things like that happen all the time. And so when I'm saying this is documented both the weapons of mass destruction thing and the incubator thing. Now in Syria you hear about the white helmets. Did everybody? Well, the white helmets are a creation of the CIA. They do help a few people, but then they create news that try to prove that the Assad regime is bombing convoys. The UN convoy was sent by the Bashar regime. It was the Syrian Red Cross, who is a government thing that was sending the medication and food to the civilian population. Would the Syrian government bomb itself? And so it's the white helmets who said, we have proof that the bomb came from the air. There was no proof. But now we have the MIT study, which is non-political, that says the rebels are bombing all the time schools and convoys. And so we're all blaming the Assad regime, and it's the rebels who are doing it. And so we are so misinformed to the point that our emotions are affected. We feel for these people, we feel disgust for the Syrian regime, but then all that is fabricated. Now, I'm not saying these are angels, right? It's a repressive regime, it's a bloody regime, but it's a nationalist regime. And it's a regime that's fighting for the good of its people in a repressive way. And it should be changed, But, how many of you play tennis? You know the notion of forced error? When you watch a match, what's the forced error? It's an error that you don't do, that your opponent sort of mismanages you to force you to make an error. Well, because we are constantly trying to destroy these regimes from inside, we are forcing them to be repressive. If they're not repressive, they'll be gone. Everybody's talking about Cuba now and Fidel Castro and how repressive he was. Well, for all the duration of his rule, the Americans have tried to foment revolutions. Look at, okay, he was repressive, but I have not seen in the media when Trudeau said something, everybody was uproar. How come? Well, the infant mortality rate in Cuba is less than in the United States. The number of medical doctors are less. When I was in Cuba for vacations, I was injured. I was treated in a public facility instantly for free, much better than in Canada. Cuba is exporting doctors all over the Middle East, all over the South America, Latin America, right? So why don't we say all this? And then we are forcing them to be repressive because we are constantly threatening by sending agents and so on to overthrow the system. And so, we when I say we, our governments, we're not clean on this. So we have no lessons to give to everybody. So we have freedom of information for us, of speech for us, right? As long as we don't exaggerate too much, right? So, so anyway, I don't like the repression of the Assad regime. I'm not saying that it's good. All I'm saying is that let's consider other factors. And I think, I wrote a paper once with the title, How the Geopolitics Have Killed Democracy in Syria. And this is what has happened. Because of calculations of a strategic nature, we have not worked to support the democratic forces. We have worked to undermine the national interests of the Syrian people. That's why we have refugees. Oh, yeah, and that wanted to bring me to, and I'll stop after that. The issue of refugees. It's a humanitarian issue. But Erdogan, when he feels that Europe doesn't do what he wants, then he sends floods of refugees. And so we react to the humanitarian crisis, but Turkey does not react to this as a humanitarian crisis, but as a strategic way of destabilizing Europe.
And that was part.
Yes.
I know we're a little time, but I wanted to ask one more question that,
Sure.
that might be of interest. Because we are groups here that are sponsoring refugees that are mostly from Syria right now.
Yes.
And I think that, and that's great in terms of humanitarian.
Absolutely.
What we would like to do as well, I think, is to get to the root causes of this, and we're grateful that you pointed out a lot of these issues that
Yeah.
go to the root causes. What can we do if we go to our government? What can we do to kind of get to those root causes and try to get Canada to kind of act in a way that we would prefer?
Right. Okay, I must say that, you know, I'm a sociologist working on Middle East issues, so I can describe social issues and historical issues, and then I have opinions. So now it's the militant who will speak. And my opinion is that we should pressure the government to have a fair policy towards Syria. That means stop supporting the Americans who want to undermine the Syrian society. The Americans, with the help of Canada, we have destroyed the Syrian state. We have destroyed the rights of the Palestinians. Our policy in Palestine is not fair at all. We have supported the colonization all over the place. Even the liberals. When there is a protest, the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, to do a little peaceful pressure against Israel so that it respects international law. We're not asking that Israel should disappear. We're saying, please respect international law. International law as indicated on the website of the Canadian government, okay? I'm very modest on this. If you go to the website of the Canadian government and you Google Middle East peace process, DFATE, Department of Foreign Affairs and Middle East peace process, you'll see 13 principles that the government upholds, okay? The government says settlements are illegal. The annexation of Jerusalem is illegal. The annexation of the Golan is illegal. The Fourth Geneva Convention applies. It says all that. But Israel doesn't do that. And we are not even asking, not pressuring, we're not even asking Israel to do it. I'm not saying we should pressure, just ask. Don't pressure, just ask. We're not even asking Israel to get out of the settlements. We're not asking Israel to get out of East Jerusalem. We tell them, let's negotiate with the Palestinians. The negotiations have been going on since 1993. And since then, Israel occupies more land than in 1993. So during the peace process, Israel has taken a bigger control of the Palestinian land. And it's twisting the arm of the Palestinians to get them to sign off their rights. Why? Because international law is on the side of the Palestinians. We are paying lip service to international law, but in practice, we are supporting Israel. And so, if you want to do something, please say to the government, first, the Middle East is not a series of separate conflicts. It's one big conflict. Make sure you have a fair policy towards Palestine and Palestinians. And when I go to see the minister, sometimes I used to go and pressure them. Every time I would print their web page. And I would say, the minister, please, this is your web page. Can you please implement it? All I'm asking is implement your own policy, official policy. Don't pay lip service to international law and then have a real policy that goes against it. That's the first thing to say. And if you want to go and you want to prepare a brief, I'll help you. Second, on Syria, I would say stop funding and supporting the forces that are destroying Syria. Let the Syrian people change their move towards a change of the repressive government through reform, not through destruction of the state. Most of the fighters now, or half of them, have been not Syrians, coming from Chechnya and Saudi Arabia and Tunis and Egypt and Algeria. These are the fighters of the rebellion. Then Turks. A lot of the, when secret services intercept the communications between the rebels, they talk in Turkish. They don't speak in Arabic. So I think we should have a fair policy in Turkey. We should stop supporting the Saudis, who are the source of this ideology, which is extremely detrimental, not just for the West. It's much more detrimental for the Muslim countries than for the West. And it's preventing reform in the Islamic countries. The Saudi Arabia who's preventing reform of Islam. So we should tell them that. Well, and there again, it's not the sociologist who speaks, but it's the, citizen who is engaged into a search for justice, and that's my reading of the search for justice. Thank you.